Well, hello out there and welcome. I'm Danny Lichtenfeld, Director of the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. I'm so pleased that you've chosen to tune in for tonight's talk by therapist Kurt White, titled Insight: What the Unseen Are Holding for Society. Tonight's talk is part of a larger exploration the Brattleboro Museum is currently engaged in into the nature of homelessness in our community and beyond. That exploration involves two exhibits that are on view right now in our galleries. Stephen Kinder, 552,830, which features larger-than-life painted portraits of people experiencing homelessness, and Coffee and Conversation, Stories of Homelessness, which features photographs and video of conversations between people in Brattleboro with stable housing and those without. Those exhibits are on view here through October 12th, and I hope you'll get a chance to come see them in person if you haven't already done so. This exploration that we're doing also involves a number of events in addition to tonight's talk. In August, we presented a virtual tour of the Stephen Kinder exhibit by curator Catherine Gass-Stowe, and we also hosted a conversation between Catherine and photographer Michael Christopher Brown, who has been documenting life on Skid Row in Los Angeles. Videos of both those presentations are available on YouTube, and you can find them on our website. In terms of what's still to come, on September 23rd, we're very excited to be hosting a Zoom presentation and Q&A with Professor Dennis Culhane of the University of Pennsylvania. He's a nationally recognized expert on the large-scale forces contributing to the problem of homelessness in America. And on October 7th, we will narrow our view of the problem to Windham County, Vermont, with a Zoom panel discussion involving a number of local experts on housing and homelessness. That panel will be moderated by Josh Davis, Executive Director of Groundworks Collaborative. Why is the Brattleboro Museum doing all of this? Well, the reason is pretty straightforward, actually. We believe, and in fact, it's been our experience, that art can sometimes provide a perspective on a challenging topic that opens up the door to greater understanding, empathy, and sometimes even creative new solutions. That's what we hope for with a project like this. And it's what motivated us in recent years to present exhibits and programs having to do with addiction and recovery, LGBTQ equality, gun control, and other topics. This kind of social exploration is not all we do here at this museum by any stretch, but it's one way we believe we can be of value to our community. And to that end, I'm very grateful that you're here tonight taking part in this conversation. The way this is going to work tonight is that I'll be leaving the screen shortly, and Kurt White will appear to give his talk. When Kurt finishes, I will come back on. We'll both be on screen, and we'll do a Q&A. If there are questions that occur to you during Kurt's talk, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type them in. And we'll save them for the end for when we get to the Q&A, but you can type them in anytime. Or when we get to the Q&A session, there's a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. You can use that, which will enable me to unmute you and you can ask your question yourself rather than typing it in. If you're watching on Facebook Live tonight and you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, just use the comment box on Facebook and we'll be keeping an eye on that and we'll address your question or comment. Lastly, before I introduce Kurt, I want to say a special thank you to our events manager, Jessica Nelson, who is doing all the behind the scenes magic necessary to make this event possible tonight. I'd also like to thank the Thomas Thompson Trust for their generous support of this project and so many other worthy causes in the Brattleboro area. And finally, I want to thank our friends at Groundworks Collaborative, an essential nonprofit organization in Brattleboro, providing food and shelter to those who need it. Tonight's talk is free, but if you think it was worth something, then I would ask you to consider making a donation to Groundworks. which you can do at groundworksvt.org/donate. And I will send that link out in the chat in just a few moments. Now just a few brief words about tonight's presenter. Kurt White is a clinical social worker, drug and alcohol counselor, and group psychotherapist who practices at the Brattleboro Retreat in Brattleboro, Vermont, where he is Senior Director of Patient Care Services. He is also adjunct professor at Smith College School for Social Work, where he has taught group theory and practice, among other courses, for over a decade. He's a fellow of the American Group Psychotherapy Association and a past president of the Vermont Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. His interests include trauma, group psychotherapy, and co-occurring disorders. He's presented on a variety of topics regionally, nationally, and internationally. We here at the Brattleboro Museum had the pleasure of working with Kurt in the planning stages of an exhibit we presented a couple years ago on addiction and recovery, and it was a total joy. Kurt's contributions made that exhibit even more powerful than it would have been otherwise. So we're very grateful to him for that and delighted to have him here once again. So won't you please welcome Kurt White.
All right. Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you to the Brattleboro Museum and for all of you in the audience watching this presentation tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't be together in person as a group therapist, and I really value the interpersonal interactions that come from even larger group meetings and talks, and try to keep some level of spontaneity going in my talks and back and forth between the audience. Of course, that part we won't be able to do tonight, but I hope to try to recapture some of the spirit of that in the way that I approach these remarks. You know, it's a shame we have to do it this way because of COVID by Zoom, me sitting here with a microphone looking like Ditka doing a broadcast or something, but we'll make the best of it. So I start maybe with a quote from a thinker that I'll talk about a little bit tonight, Donald Winnicott, famous, he was a pediatrician and psychoanalyst in London, passed away some decades ago, but was very influential to a lot of social workers and psychotherapists that came afterward, and did a lot of work with understanding how fantasy works and reality and the early mother-child bond. It might not be an obvious link to our topic today, but I hope to maybe link it up a little. So this quote, just to frame things, it's a joy to be hidden and a disaster to not be found. So again, I'll hopefully get more relevant. First, just a few disclaimers. Myself, I'm not a person who's ever experienced homelessness firsthand. I strongly recommend, if you're aiming to learn more about the experience of homelessness, to engage with people who have and who've written about it, talk about it, as well as with experts and people that can talk about statistical and trends and shed light on some of the complexities of it. At the same time, I'm also an introvert, you know, although I play an extrovert on TV sometimes, you know, and so I'm not, you know, the question of what do we do, you know, this was sort of how some of this talk was framed to me. What do we do when we encounter someone who is homeless or apparently homeless, and how do we react to that? I'm not actually trying to give you advice about that. I don't have the correct answer about that. And quite frankly, I am shy enough that I don't really like to be approached by anybody on the street one way or another, homeless or otherwise. So a wide variation. And a little about my background. I come from Michigan, where we were sort of interlopers in a wealthy suburb. My mother, a full-time graduate student, always looking to find ways to get into good school systems, and complicated social identity there, but with a lot of social privilege also. went to school in Chicago, which was probably the first place that I really encountered visible homelessness. Living in Hyde Park at the University of Chicago, it was a regular sort of kind of encounter. And I think one of the things that I first learned, the sort of unspoken social dynamic, is that you're not supposed to ever acknowledge that people who are experiencing homelessness exist at all as human beings. You're meant to walk by them and not say anything, not engage, dismiss. And there's reasons for that and the rest of it. Like I said, I'd rather not be approached at all anyway. But I think there's something about the psychology of that that's interesting and that's complicated. And what does it mean that we've taken that in? What does it mean that we've learned that? What does it say about us? And what is happening in this system where there's a group of people that can hardly be acknowledged as sort of fully human or fully participating in the rest of life and society? And it troubled me. I haven't solved it, but it troubled me still. And went on to do work in Boston and Holyoke, all the places where there's homelessness is a visible issue, and now in Vermont. And I've been in my role at the retreat, various roles, encountered as a therapist, administrator, supervisor, individuals experiencing homelessness, as psychotherapy clients of mine, people with housing insecurities, long-term homelessness, short-term intermittent homelessness, many variations, families living in shelters together. And for the last quite a number of years now, we've been doing a collaboration with Brattleboro Memorial Hospital and especially Groundworks Collaborative, which I would also like to shout out to as a fantastic organization doing work in this community, of trying to design systems and that help to actually meet the needs of the homeless populations more than they would otherwise. So as some background to say, where am I coming from with all of this? Some of my aims, I think many of you probably expect that I'm trying to help increase understanding, develop context, compassion, maybe equanimity. Some of you might expect I'm here to challenge certain assumptions that we make about homelessness and power and privilege in society, and to complicate the picture of things that you might already have. To break through some of the usual noise about this population that tends to drive us into looking at extremes, at caricatures of all good or all bad sorts of dynamics. That happens a lot with this population. And a few of you might suspect that I'm here to directly challenge a system that is inequitable, that makes it so that there even has to be such a thing as a shelter or a homeless person, which, by the way, is, I think, largely a construct. This is something that we have created. It is, of course, a real problem, but as we've created it through complicated, not accidental social inequities, dynamics that have emerged not naturally or incidentally or voluntarily from the point of view of those experiencing it. And that group would probably be right about what I'm aiming to do, but some of all of that. I want people to think about their own reactions here and when you think about and reflect on encounters with individuals that might be experiencing homelessness, but not for your sake really, but for what these reactions tell us about the social structure that we're all embedded in. I want people to think about what does it mean really that this is a almost totally solvable problem, homelessness in America, and yet we have failed to come even remotely close to solving it. And how is that? And what is the sort of psychology of those dynamics and our part in them? I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that anyone here is doing anything wrong or that we've caused homelessness or responsible for it. This is a problem we've inherited, but it's a problem that I think is our responsibility. And a lot of if I have some insight into this, it might be partially because I've looked inside and all of the things that I'm talking about, I can find in my own reactions here also, even some of the less pleasant bits of it. So we'll move on. I was a little skeptical at first with the origin of the talk. You know, I don't want to fall into the trap of looking at this group as a sort of a kind of an other, where there's like a right and a wrong thing to do, or we're supposed to be approaching it in a certain way, or to exotify this group in a way that sets them apart from us more than they are already apart from it. But the more I thought about it, the more I really appreciated that I think there is something quite profound about what's seen and not seen in society, how that leads us to, I think, certain understandings of how we experience homelessness. And I feel relatively comfortable speculating about that. Partially, I think, because psychotherapy, too, as a discipline, is also concerned with this question of the visible and the invisible over and over again. I relate to this. Many of the labors of the psychotherapy world are private labors. They're never to be shared outside of the dyads and small groups where the interactions, sacred interactions, take place. Perhaps a few supervisors and vague medical notes that nobody reads. And also, much of the suffering that exists in people's experiences is invisible and shared perhaps with the therapist and maybe not so many others. And so the idea of something important, but just below the surface, just below the level of sort of a more public consciousness, is of particular interest to me. And mental health problems, much like homelessness, when they're reported about, are often reported about in very negative and stereotypical ways. And I think there's reasons for that, as we might get into. But again, to sort of jump back into the world of developmental psychology, or talk for a minute about what makes it hard to see anybody. There's another quote from Winnicott about he's imagining an early parent-child bond. He says mother here, but it could be father or any caregiver. He says the mother gazes at the baby in her arms, and the baby gazes at his mother's face and finds himself therein, provided that the mother is really looking at the unique, small, helpless being and not projecting her own expectations, fears, and plans for the child. In that case, the child would not find himself in the mother's face, but rather the mother's own projections. The child would remain without a mirror, and the rest of life would be seeking that mirror in vain. And so I'm sort of wondering here and thinking about developmental psychology, if there might be some parallel to this in the world of social psychology and our own interpersonal psychology of experiencing a group of individuals that is has a particular kind of condition that's viewed in a society in a particular way. The condition of homelessness, I mean to say, not an interpersonal condition, but a descriptive one. What projections might exist here that might be informative for us? And what might this group of homeless individuals know about our own humanity that we've failed to sort of fully integrate into ourselves? I also wanted to say a lot of what we're talking about here is visibility, but actually I've also largely experienced homeless individuals as a largely invisible group, actually, often seeking to stay out of sight or pushed there by individuals that didn't want to look at them. Also made invisible by their marginalized identities, including just the identity of being a homeless individual. And also their many hidden challenges, which, by the way, statistically, you'll understand also involves a lot of mental health and substance abuse issues, domestic violence, complicated, chronic, and acute medical issues. We've done some studies of this, informal studies around in the population seeking health services in Brattleboro, and the numbers are quite astounding and getting worse. The work of a therapist is to make visible the invisible dynamics that exist in individuals, groups, and culture. Usually we do it in individuals and groups, but today I'll try to do it a little bit in culture. couple of stories. In Chicago, I don't know if people don't know this, but the city burned at one point and they rebuilt it, but they rebuilt it higher up in the middle of downtown. So that actually underneath the streets of downtown, there are lower streets. They're literally upper and lower streets. And people don't go down there much, but there are some reasons to go down there. And the trucks that deliver, the hidden business of the city is conducted there. But when I lived there, if you were to go down there, you might find large encampments of homeless individuals because it's a little warmer in winter. The exhaust for the buildings is sort of pumped into it, and they're sheltered from the rain and the elements. And it left an impression on me, and I thought, oh my God, it's literally here under our feet. There's a hidden, unseen world that we don't really want to look at. And I thought, I wonder what that's about. Similarly, in Cambridge, Mass, I was taking a walk one day with a hospitalized psychiatric patient of the hospital there, which is a thing you used to be able to do, take people outside. He sort of gave me a tour, having been homeless many times in his life, of all of the ways that things that were visible but also not seen, a whole other world that existed that he knew about, but I didn't know about, and he educated me. And so what to make of these stories? I think sometimes one thing might just be that the world is often a darker place than we can imagine easily. And imagine is sort of a key word here, because I think it's often actually a failure of the imagination that keeps this problem from being meaningfully solved or addressed. There are, of course, social consequences of invisibility. I was listening this week to Wilkinson's new book, The Cast, and she, paraphrasing her, she described this. She said, well, we didn't build this house, in which we have structural inequity and racism, especially she's talking about, but we live in it now. And it's like an old house that has problems and we have to take care of it. And she said, as any owner of an old home will know, that which is not looked at will never be fixed. And as an owner of an old home, I can particularly appreciate and relate to that. And so I think we also should look at what ways is homelessness visible. Often I think it's visible in our minds before it's visible in the world of reality. We have a mental picture of somebody who may be experiencing homelessness, something that exists in our minds. We can call it to mind, but also exists partially outside of our awareness, influenced by our own experiences of others, stereotypes, fear, perhaps unconscious bias. And it's usually a fairly negative picture of one particular version of homelessness that is not at all a complete picture. Again, remembering most of it is actually out of sight, but that's in our mind. One can also see the visibility of this group in the consequences of long-term homelessness, or the long-term effects of severe poverty, mental health problems, racism and structural inequity, substance use disorders. So sometimes what do we see actually when we see on the street a picture of homelessness? Not in our imagination. Sometimes that's not a pretty picture either. We can all imagine our own particularly unpleasant stories. Evidence of substance use, needles left around, bottles of alcohol, for example, other things like that. In Brattleboro, the panhandling as a problem has come up a lot and again as to what should be done about it. Not that everyone that panhandles is an individual experiencing homelessness, but it's more prevalent among that group. I think these are separate problems, but they are interrelated. It's a way that it's sometimes visible. Sometimes we see a shift in the use of public or semi-public spaces, sometimes in ways that we would rather not see. We see behaviors associated with substance use disorders, including sometimes very negative things like crime or I met with the business owners last year and had a great deal of compassion for the ways that they were struggling with individuals who had perhaps nowhere to be, or wanted to be doing something other than they were usually doing, sort of hanging out in their areas, and sometimes causing significant problems to themselves or others or to shoppers, but sometimes we see these things. Only very occasionally, I think, do we really see in our public consciousness stories of triumph over homelessness or overcoming homelessness. It almost seems like a kind of a brand that is hard for people to get beyond, actually. A notable, interesting exception I could think of to that is an experience of the comedian Tiffany Haddish, who was homeless, living in her car for quite some time. Has gone on to be a tremendously successful individual. Credits those, by the way, who actually helped her, encouraged her, and helped lift her up in that particular situation. I think sometimes that it's hard, well, I'll get into that a little bit later. What actually comes up in the individual that is having an experience of an encounter with another person, whether this is a sort of a visual, I'm seeing something happening in front of me, or I've been approached. I think this is a complicated set of reactions. Sometimes compassion is certainly stirred up. Sometimes so is judgment, so is fear. We'll get into some of that a little bit more lately, but I think it stretches our imaginations to consider and really digest such experiences, which may be so very different from our own. I think it actually creates a sort of an interruption, a disruption of our own experience that is difficult for us to digest. I'm going to talk for a little bit about fantasy and reality here. Which is also something that developmental psychologists are interested in, because the world as it is something that we learn to perceive in earliest childhood, and that we learn to negotiate, and that we learn to be flexible with or rigid with, and sometimes and of course, in times of greater stress, we tend to be more rigid, but some people are also more rigid than others in this way. And how do we learn to do this as a social process? This is a speculative world where we get into some of this, but I think some of it might be useful speculation. I suspect that there is a complication or fantasy that emerges about how the world works, that we carry around a lot of the time, and that an encounter with an individual experiencing homelessness will forcibly challenge that fantasy, whether or not the individual has been forceful at all. If we really see them and try to take in what their experience is, I think it automatically causes a level of difficulty and anxiety that is difficult to digest. Some of the elements of that fantasy could include, for example, an idea that we have an equality of opportunity, that everyone had an opportunity to succeed, and some did and some didn't. But I think if we encounter someone who's sufficiently suffering, it maybe challenges that idea that we like to believe, that is comfortable for us. A sense of justice, that things are fair in the world, that hard work is rewarded. I think it challenges also for especially the well-meaning and humanitarian among us. I count myself in this group. It challenges the potency of our own intentions, that it ought to seem to us like that our own wish that things would not be this way would be enough to make a visible difference. And yet sometimes it isn't so. I think it challenges the idea that complex social problems can be solved with simple interventions. We might ask ourselves, for example, is a shelter, that's an obviously necessary intervention in the practical reality of the world, but is this ever an adequate solution to the problem of homelessness? I would say that it is not, and it is so obviously not that it's a kind of a magical thinking in a way to imagine that it might be. I think our deeply rooted Western sense of individualism and personal responsibility can get challenged, a value that I think can make it difficult to understand that there are underlying systems that have contributed to the problem of homelessness more than an individual's particular circumstances and set of choices in their lives. I think this is a useful, in a practical ways, in a day-to-day way, it's useful to believe that we have a sort of an individual deterministic way of approaching the world. It reassures us. It gives us a comfort in our own social position. Nonetheless, it might not be especially accurate. I think it challenges also the idea that the world exists within certain understandable boundaries, that there is a certain kind of limit to the sufferings that can be experienced. And I think when we see something outside of that, it automatically makes us anxious. There's a wonderful story by the Mexican author, now long passed away, Juan Rulfo, a short story called "We're Very Poor." And it starts with the line, it's told from the point of view of a young boy in a rural area after a flood, perhaps something we can relate to, that says, things are going from bad to worse here. Right? Things are going from bad to worse. And I remember I read this, I was very struck by it a long time ago, because you really realize what he's talking about is that the entire spectrum of his life, you know, if you could imagine, you know, worse is over here and bad is over here, and over here is like moderately okay, and over here is excellent. He has no experience of anything except in the spectrum of from bad to worse. And I think that's, quite frankly, a terrifying prospect that we have to defend ourselves against in an interpersonal way. So I think that when we have this kind of encounter, these kinds of things come up. I think even more, maybe it can challenge also our own sense of worth, our own sense of earned comfort, you know, and which is a sort of a wonderful fantasy that we have. How can we deal with it if we understand that the comfort in life that we have is perhaps only partially earned, as it always is in reality? There we are. There's that word, reality. And I think we have often a failure here in society, not so much among individuals, but a failure in society to acknowledge reality as it truly is. The failure to acknowledge this sort of tendency in us to marginalize, to narrow, to create outcasts and actually cast them out or put them on Lower Wacker Drive in Chicago. By the way, during the time I lived there, the city also decided they couldn't tolerate people in the undercity, and they expelled them from that to some other place, which is a dynamic that exists over and over and over again in most places in the country, of moving people around from this or that temporary encampment to another one. To failure to acknowledge the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals by systems that have power. Although I think, you know, in this area, we're doing a lot of work on these issues. If you look at it historically, it has not been such a nice relationship between law enforcement and homeless populations. It's not been such a nice relationship between hospitals and homeless populations. In fact, there's a whole long and complicated history of various kinds of exploitation in those realms. I think there's a failure to acknowledge that the reason that systems aren't helping in more visible ways is that the systems were not designed to help this population. I recently had to have a medical procedure that involved me being at a hospital overnight, very, very standard routine kind of thing, test. And it was in my mind that an individual that had a lot of complicated needs that we were dealing with in community collaboration to try to help them also needed this test, and it involved going to a specialty hospital for the test. And as I thought of this person as I was going through it, and I thought, the system wasn't designed for them at all. It was designed for people like me that know how to navigate systems that have a certain amount of privilege, right? And the idea that they could sort of just do this was completely ridiculous. And so I think, what does it mean, you know, when we have a fantasy that our systems were designed for everybody, and all of a sudden we're challenged with evidence that they're obviously not. They obviously are not. I also think, and this is a difficult one, but a teacher of mine, Yavan Agasarian, who was experienced not directly herself, but her family, the Armenian genocide, and herself grew up in basically as a refugee in the United Kingdom, living with charity organizations there, became one of the more brilliant analysts of systems that I ever met. She's passed away now, but she sort of described that there is a tendency in the human condition, and not a very pretty one, to want to destroy, to annihilate differences, that we don't want to acknowledge and integrate them, that perhaps there are, you know, reasonable, reasons why we have this in us, but it's difficult for us to take in that which is not the same. I think this is also especially true, maybe doubly true, for those that are prone to what I would call utopian striving. If we are striving for utopia, we're often failing to acknowledge the reality of the world that we stand in at the moment. I will also say, as much as I love living in Vermont, I think there's a certain amount of utopian striving and also atavistic striving that exist in the Vermont brand. I remember some years ago on an inpatient unit trying to help someone out who was come to the hospital from New York City, and was a teacher there, and and she was on a unit in the midst of the opioid crisis with a lot of people suffering from opioid use disorder. And she said, "Oh my God, I can't believe it." She said, "I thought all that Vermont was just green everywhere. I didn't know you had these problems too." But in a way, why should that be shocking? Of course we have these problems too. We live in the same society. It's shocking, I think, because perhaps we have a greater willingness than others to turn our heads away from the reality that is in front of us. So I think if we want to try to turn that into something a little positive, we could try to say, what is it then that we can learn about our own humanity by looking at this group that has been so intentionally shut off from the avenues of accessing humanity that are normally open to other individuals. Pivoting for a moment to this concept of holding, which is in the title of the talk. So often it was an intentional reference on my part to, again, the work of Winnicott, who talks about the holding environment in psychotherapy, the holding environment of the early child. He often means this in a developmental psychology model, both literally and figuratively, that there is a holding that happens in the early parent-caregiver bond that helps the individual develop an accurate enough presentation, an accurate enough representation of the world, that there is an illusion in it, and there is frustration in it, but there's also reality in it, is sort of how he means it. And I don't think we have to look very hard to understand that life is, in many ways, a series of unpleasant compromises. We never exactly get our needs met in relationships in a perfect way. We're seldom even feel like we're completely understood by others, right? So this is in the individual level, this is a challenge. And I think if we sort of try to port that into the social domain, I think we can see here that there is also perhaps a mechanism operating here that involves the denial of reality for the perpetuation of our fantasies about how the world works, as well as, I think, something, even a turn of the screw deeper than that, which has to do with acknowledging the vulnerability, the fundamental vulnerability of the human condition. So if we remember Winnicott's discussion of the baby needing to be seen as an individual in their own right and not as a reflection of their parents' fantasies, I wonder if there maybe is true of the most vulnerable individuals in our society also. And what the mirror what mirror might they be showing to us also that we don't want to see? I think there is a mirror here for us, but it's a hard one to look into. Illusion is not necessarily a negative thing. If we're not perceiving reality completely correctly, that's okay, because we also have the opportunity as responsible citizens to make something different of the world than it is. I think if we go too far into utopian or atavistic strivings, we're not going to get there. But I think there is a way in which Winnicott talks about the opening up of the play space, that the child learns to deal with the frustrations of reality through the development of creativity. And I wonder for us, if all of a sudden, if we're able to get into a different kind of frame of approaching this problem, if all of a sudden unsolvable problems might become less unsolvable. So I think this sort of issue again of what comes up for us in an encounter and what does it signify is one that we should linger on for a few moments longer. I think the idea of looking away or turning away from someone experiencing homelessness or somebody who's suffering is not so much about the literal turning away. It's about the turning away that happens in our own minds. And the feelings that we have might be indications of the need to turn away. I've given you some large-scale interpretations of why that might be so. But here are some ways in which that might show up in terms of our own emotional experience. Helplessness, guilt, a felt sense of unfairness, anger, a sense of injustice, disgust, revulsion, fear, self-righteousness, perhaps, And so I think these are unpleasant feelings and might be enough reason in and of themselves to wish to look away and to have some sort of different experience or encounter than that which we might have. I think this kind of experience leads us, should be unpacked a little bit though, looking at it through different dimensions. The individual might very well wonder, what do I do now? And there comes the helplessness, denial, and anger, especially in the lack of easy and obvious solutions. We can make a donation to Groundworks, and perhaps we should, but it doesn't really have the effect of making the feeling totally better. It still, I think, is a group that has to be shut out a little in the mind. As a group, we might wonder, what do we do? And is it enough? I think also probably there's a sense of looking at how does the group that you belong to interact with or assimilate this group? Are we large enough to have this difference? There has been a narrative in Brattleboro that comes up periodically that the homeless population comes from somewhere else, that they're coming from out of state, that they're coming to the hospital and then they end up homeless here. And I'm sure sometimes these things do happen. But over and over again, Groundworks has looked into this, and statistically, they say it's not true. It's not accurate. Homeless individuals in Vermont are largely Vermonters. They're coming from Vermont. They're from here. But what does it mean that we might say that we don't feel like they're from here? I think it means that we don't feel like we have a large enough ability to feel safe enough to integrate this group into our own social group construct. And I think we probably don't really feel safe enough to do so because it challenges so many underlying assumptions about how our society works. From a social or all society point of view, we might look at, can we look at the root causes of all of this? This is very difficult to do. Can we ask the question, what makes it so easy to buy a warplane or a nuclear weapon, but not fund something as simple as transitional housing commensurate with the need in society, to understand that these are not, that homelessness is not an accidental creation, but reflections of the values and unconscious processes that exist collectively in society, which again, we inherited, but which are our responsibility to have to take care of. So what comes up, I think denial is the thing that really in the end emerges as a mechanism of protection against the helplessness, guilt, and rage. If you're interested in short stories from an American tradition that highlights the unconscious mechanism of denial, I recommend the works of John Cheever, by the way, whom I think was living in a very kind of bohemian lifestyle and encountering individuals very different from himself and his own upbringing when he was writing a lot of the short stories he was most famous for. I think all of this also leads us to think about the nature of suffering, which is and the sort of complicated truth that suffering is hard to compare, but it's also not equal. And some people are having an almost unimaginably difficult time. And I think, what do we do with that knowledge? What do we really do with it? I think further complications relate to the unconscious bias that we often have against individuals with mental health and substance abuse problems, judgments related to those things. And also, I think, the wish to be a kind of a non-participant and someone who opts out of the system that creates these problems. But we're all in it together or not at all, I think, is the answer to it. So I promised the organizers at the start that I would only talk so long as I could hold people's interest. I hope everyone is still interested in here. I have a few conclusions, maybe a couple more minutes. I think this idea of a failure of imagination is an important thing, because I think the converse to that would be if we can get our imagination going again, if we could feel secure enough to integrate differences, we might find that we can do a lot more than we ever thought possible. An interesting example of this is homelessness during the COVID epidemic. Sometimes there's nothing like a good crisis to jumpstart the imagination, as awful as the COVID crisis is, and I wish we were not having it. It was always a completely impossible thing, it seemed, to keep the homeless population off the streets, and to give them a safe place to stay during the months that emergency shelters were not operating, until COVID hit, and all of a sudden there was a will to do so, and ever since then people have been housed in a very, I must say, makeshift but a set of emergency housing situations largely in hotels in the area that have been secured for that purpose. And I think some very creative things are being done. I wonder also, what else might we be able to do? What might all of a sudden become possible that felt impossible before? I would say again that turning away is a mental process, something deeper than individual interactions. It's a distancing process, and it serves a practical purpose for us. I think we also should examine why do we mistake the problem of homelessness to be something that requires solutions of an individual's action. I have to volunteer at Thanksgiving time. I have to do this or that or the other thing. Those are all good things to do, but it's not a problem that can be solved through individual action. It needs collective action. And for that, I think we have to start clearing away some unconscious social mental obstacles. I also think we have to acknowledge that we have a wealth redistribution system that funnels wealth up the chain rather than down the chain, in a way that actually negatively impacts most of society, and it rests on an illusion of competitive fairness. Seeing homelessness for what it is often the sort of very bottom of the flattened pyramid of wealth distribution, is a threat to the social order. It's a status quo. It preserves the status quo of sort of doing a little bit but never quite enough. It's a sort of social enactment of an unconscious denial mechanism. To this, I say, I think the homeless individuals are not visible enough, or at least the problem of homelessness is not visible enough. I wonder, when we look at those that don't fit in for whatever reason in society, is our world large enough to integrate all of these experiences? Can we make room for difference? And how can we make the kinds of investments needed to create real, meaningful, and lasting change? Some practical solutions might be to invest in a significant way in real housing first options, things like the Great River Terrace model with supports for individuals. And I think if we have the institutional will to do this in a time of emergency, we should be able to find some institutional will to be able to do it the rest of the time also. But it involves all of us and can't be outsourced. So with that, I'll conclude. It's been about 50 minutes. That's what I said I would talk, and we can have some time for questions, reactions, or thoughts from the audience.
Kurt, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Wow, you kind of blew my mind. I don't know how everyone else is feeling, but in that relatively short span of time, you said a number of things that kind of turned a number of intuitions upside down for me. So I might be interested in asking you, about some of those things, but I would really like first to open this up to our audience who are tuned in here in the hopes that they may have some questions or comments for you, and I'll pass those along. So again, everyone is invited to type your questions in using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or I think there's a raise hand button. And if you click that, I'll see a little icon next to your name on my list, and I can unmute you. A couple of people have just typed in a few things in the chat box. Donna asked, since COVID, how has the homeless situation in Brattleboro changed? She typed that in early before you addressed that a little bit toward the end. I don't know if there's anything else you wish to say about that.
Yeah, actually there is. I think I pointed to one thing that went a bit better structurally, that all of a sudden there was a way to do something. But unfortunately, we also, I'm using the we in the sort of broad sense of the social service system trying to respond, although it was really, again, groundworks that did the heavy lifting with all of this. Trying to respond with no time in a total emergency situation. And so it's the build a bike while you're riding it kind of problem. And it's not been perfect for everybody. And it's definitely not an ideal long-term solution. But I do think in a great many ways it's a great improvement on having people sleep in ditches over the summer months, or in tents down by the river, just out of sight on your way to Walmart. It's better than that. But also, if you think about how you've been affected by COVID, I can think about how I've been affected by COVID. It's been among the most stressful and challenging times in my entire life for a whole variety of reasons related to this epidemic. If you're somebody who already has a series of struggles, problems, challenges on the margins, it's going to affect you very likely exponentially more. And we've seen this. There was a spike in opioid overdose deaths that happened in this population in Brattleboro since the start of the COVID epidemic. That seems to be consistent with the national data and trends. There have been some individuals definitely who are more isolated, struggling more, needing more supports, but perhaps also not wanting them. And also the usual routines of camping in the summertime for that group of homeless individuals is although not at all ideal, was it often a pattern that people were at least used to, and now they're doing something new, and that's also a challenge to find something new. So yeah, many complicated structural things are worse because of COVID, probably more so than anything that improved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to read I have now a couple of questions that have been submitted in the Q&A. Jean asks, have people now in our motels been asked about how that is for them, what is working and what the challenges are?
Oh, great question. Although you might get a better answer in a couple of weeks when you have the panel discussion with the includes folks from Groundworks. But I'm involved. Part of my involvement is to supervise one of the clinicians that is embedded there and to be part of this team along with that clinician we call HealthWorks that aims to sort of try to plug holes in the system and create better systems. And it's my understanding that there is an almost continuous feedback loop that exists between the Groundworks staff and those serving the shelter population about this. But I think to speak to the details of what the aggregate findings are would be a challenge. I think for most it is better to have a roof than to not have a roof, but there are also challenges in communal living and isolated living in rooms by oneself that are also difficult. So,
thank you, Kurt. I would just offer to anyone from Groundworks who's who's tuned in right now and watching, if you want to use the raise hand button to be able to respond to anything that Kurt is saying or that anyone is asking, please feel free to do that. I also have a question here from Cindy. Have you seen a workable solution in any other city? If so, what have they done to make a difference?
Well, I think if you want, I'm not necessarily, most of what I do every day is a hospital person and a therapist, and I'm often have a head down, and although I probably seem like a bit of an academic nerd tonight, and I'm that also. So I haven't studied it systematically, but I think if you look at like the Veterans Administration, for example, has done a kind of a full court press in the last several years to try to have a basically zero homeless vets initiative where they literally are tracking people down wherever they are and finding housing solutions for them. It's, there's like any other large giant system like that. It's had its own problems, but it's also had some really significant and profound successes. And I think it's an example of what the arm of those that really have resources, like large government entities, can do if there really is a willingness and push behind it. It's an interesting thing also sociologically that maybe we consider homeless veterans a notch above other homeless individuals. That's often an unexamined assumption in terms of how much they deserve the help of others. I know that other systems and communities have done good things too, but I'm not sure I could point to a model. Perhaps the next speaker that has more of an academic area of study is things like that might be a good question for them too.
And so just as a reminder, because of in the nature of some of the questions that are coming up, if you visit brattleboromuseum.org, there's information there on the other upcoming events. So September 23rd, national expert scholar from University of Pennsylvania speaking primarily about large-scale societal forces as they relate to homelessness. And then October 7th, a panel of local experts on housing from a number of different angles, that what's happening with the housing market, the real estate market right now, but also affordable housing and homelessness. We'll all be getting together to talk about what's going on right here in Windham County. So I hope many of you will tune in for those as well. Kurt, there's a question from Jaden. Does it surprise you how many people are homeless who do not fit the stereotypical appearance of a, quote, homeless person?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to talk a bit about that, but then I thought maybe I'd leave that for others to unpack. But absolutely, there's a whole group of individuals. Some of them are sort of transiently homeless for brief periods of time, or homeless but kind of couch surfing. They have no address, but they are not kind of in the system of shelters that exist, professional shelters. Groundworks, by the way, and organizations like it often also try to keep tabs on those individuals and their needs so that they can help, which I think is really quite profound. And that's probably even a larger group. And then you have the sheltered individuals and people who are unsheltered, literally homeless on the street, not in shelters. And then and also a great deal of families that are homeless and become homeless or homeless for periods of time, homeless children and the rest. And I think our vision of the homeless, to be more specific about it, is often the long-term homeless, the homeless individuals that often have really pretty significant co-occurring mental health and often substance abuse disorder issues at the same time, or often the victims of complicated and profound traumas, not just during the time that they're homeless, but also it's a very vulnerable thing to be homeless. People are exploited frequently and the rest. But that's only one sliver of the whole. And yeah, people. People would be shocked to learn how many people and how different they look than those that are sort of than our perceptions.
For sure. So I have a question I want to ask you, Kurt, which is a lot of what you said. I came into this talk tonight with the thought. With the pretty clear thought that it's important for us not to turn away. But you really, you dove into that in a way that is making me rethink that a little bit. That there are reasons, like reasonable reasons why we turn away, and there are ways in which it may be okay to turn away. And that got me thinking that it's also, you said something about exotifying people, which made me think that there can be hazards associated with, like staring, or, the opposite of turning away, but like really shining a spotlight. And all of that causes me to really, feel a little unsettled and confused about what's, the merits of behaving a certain way. And it also makes me wonder, and so I'm asking you for your honest opinion, what you think about the value or not of an exhibit like this one that we have up in the museum now, where the artist with the, the ascent of the people whose portraits he has painted these larger than life portraits, and we have them hanging in a museum in a very intentional way. The idea being we wanted to display them in a way that requires viewers to lift their heads to see these people, because that's very different than the way one ordinarily sees these people. And the portraits are kind of hung all around the space in an unusual way. So it's hard to avoid them if you come into the space. We did all that with a certain kind of conviction that's a good place to start. But I wonder what your thoughts are about an exercise like this and an exhibit like this. Maybe it's more complicated than we're thinking.
I'm a natural skeptic, so I approach everything with a bit of wariness, and I like to complicate it if I can. I think there is both a potential benefit and a potential danger from the elite institutions of culture approaching a problem like this. Just like I think there's a potential danger in the idea that if all I do is not literally turn away from somebody, that I've somehow done a good thing. And I'm trying to say, I don't know that it matters that much. I think if we can see other people in our hearts as real full human beings that exist and have lives of their own, then maybe we will naturally respond differently to them. But it's not like a talisman or something that will sort of ward off the discomfort that that the problem itself creates in us. I think the good part about an exhibit like this is that it creates dialogue, and I think if that dialogue is sincere, and I think if it involves especially people who are directly affected and has an intentional mission to outreach in the way that I think the Brattleboro Museum has done and tried to do, is stretch its comfort zone, then we're probably better off for it. As a therapist, I'm always most worried about the things that people aren't talking about. If we're talking about something, we're probably doing better than we would be if we weren't talking about it. But if the question is, are we in some ways also contributing to the problem, including, just to take myself as an example, to put on a tie and a nice pair of shoes that you can't see and talk about it as an expert, yeah, probably we're also contributing to the problem. But you know, it's the house that we inherited.
One quick anecdote that about how this has played out for us so far that has I have felt hopeful about. We had a comment from someone who looked at these portraits, and the artist chose to paint the portraits of these people without any obvious indicators of their homelessness. You know, without any, they're not portraits showing them holding signs or cups, collection cups, or any of the trappings around them. And one person responded to that saying, it made me, I feel like any number of those men who are depicted there look just like me, look very much like me. And I took him to be saying that that made him maybe relate to these people in this very different circumstance in a more empathetic way. I found that to be hopeful. So there are a lot of things.
And I think there's like the photography exhibit you had before that you mentioned in the introduction. I could interrupt you, but it was similarly wonderful from my point of view, because it portrayed the lives of people in recovery doing things like sitting on couches. And instead of, you ever notice how the photographs of people with addictive disorders are usually on train tracks, as if everyone with struggling with substance use hangs out on train tracks all day long? That's a weird stereotype that goes back to origins in the early part of the century. Hobos and the rest. It conjures it, totally unconscious. And so to see people doing something simple as sitting on a couch and having a conversation might actually be transformative, you know. Maybe if people can see it and for what it is. And anyway, you were going to ask me something else.
Well, no, thank you for that. And that reminds me, you know, that points to the, I think, real simple on one hand, but really powerful and elegant and effective other exhibit that's up right now, the one that was supported by Groundworks and primarily carried out by Liz Livornia, which is photographs of people in Brattleboro, two human beings sitting on a bench and over a cup of coffee, talking to one another, one who happens to have stable housing and one who didn't, at least at that time. I think it gets at what you're saying about seeing people in this other kind of context and away from that, whether it's train tracks or whatever other kind of stereotype, really makes it, you know, immediately makes it very hard to understand someone as just another human being.
Right. And I think also there are powerful unconscious assumptions about what it means to be housed and what it doesn't. And you see it in things like the bones of the terms, like take one landlord, right? And now landlords are important individuals, but the origin of the term landlord, not hard to find it. It goes back to the landed gentry and the feudalism era, where basically the landlord was the person that had all the money and all the rights and all the power, and the people that lived under them had nothing at all. I think if you look back to the origins of this country, who was it that got the ability to vote? Well, we systematically excluded African Americans and women, but we also excluded anybody that didn't own property. Owning property was the way to be a full participant in society, and anybody that didn't was less than. These are complicated historical trends that leave an imprint in the sort of social psychology and collective unconscious of the group. Now, of course, we can challenge this on an individual level, but it's an inward-looking process that involves tolerating discomfort and trying to do what the ideal parent would do, which would be to sort of see with the eyes of someone that really wants to observe an other, wants to observe somebody that has a full life of their own and needs that maybe have nothing to do with you. And if we can do that, then we're in a position, I think, to be creative about it. But also understanding the reality that as individuals, we have a certain amount of powerlessness and understandable denial that comes up. But if we can tolerate the feelings, maybe we can move toward collective action and social action that's more meaningful than what we currently have going on. That was a recap in 2 sentences, two run-on sentences.
I want to extend one final invitation for anyone else who wants to weigh in here or ask questions or jump into the conversation. Please feel free to do so. I just have one more prompt that I hope you'll respond to, Kurt. A lot of what you, and somebody's just typed something into the chat box, which I'll read in a moment. So a lot of what you said made me kind of, feel like I need to think a little further and recalibrate what are useful, positive things to be doing or not. But one thing that you mentioned very quickly that I took as you saying this is clearly a good thing. This, is you referred to as housing first.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate briefly on what that means?
Sure. Yeah, there was very often, even in the
social... Josh, I see you. I'm sorry, and so I see Josh has his hand raised as well, so we'll get to Josh, and I'll read this other comment in just a moment. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, no, it's okay. Even in the social services world of those that are trying to help, one of the ways that we've often put up obstacles to helping in the homeless field is that we've put conditions on who is entitled to help. If you have a substance use disorder, you can go to treatment, get sober, and once you're sober for a while, then you get housing. You get mental health treatment, for a while, then you get housing. Housing first is a model that says, oh my God, that's all wrong. Those are value judgments that we're putting on people as obstacles. And actually what we need to do is, if you think just Maslow's hierarchy of needs, get people's basic needs met. And putting a roof over their head before you worry about if they're in recovery or not in recovery, but you provide supports to them also so that people have the best possible chance of success while you're doing this. That actually turns out to be a very effective intervention to solve those other problems. Housing is actually a mental health intervention. And so it's a sort of turning the system as we used to know it on its head. And I think we struggle as a society to really believe in that because of this, I think, this idea of a sort of an individual having to earn something that's given to them. But I think that's the wrong framework. It's one that's deep in most of us, but and in society generally. But
and if I'm not mistaken, that's a fundamental, I don't know if I would call it a philosophy or approach that Groundworks ascribes to, housing first.
They I know the Groundworks folks quite well. So I remember many years ago, I sat with them and I said, we're not really having it yet. I know this is the philosophy, but I don't see the result. Where's the result? And I didn't mean that they had to create the result, but I was frustrated. But they've done much more than I would have ever thought possible in a community that has actually very little practical resources compared to Burlington, for example, in actually implementing significant elements of a real housing first model. So.
Well, I think the person who I'm about to unmute here is Josh from Groundworks. I'm not 100% sure of that, but let me see if I can figure out how to unmute him. No, that's chatting with him. Jessica, are you able? Oh, Josh, are you there?
I think he could probably talk now. Yeah.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Danny. Hi, Kurt. So
Hey,
good
Josh.
to be with you. First of all, so much gratitude for all the kind words about the work that we do at Groundworks, our incredible staff. And so I'm just very appreciative that we are a present part of this conversation, even though we are not on the panel. And Kurt, very, I guess, just a great way to look at, and a very different way to look at what is happening on the street and how we as individuals interact with what's going on. I think something that I want to underscore is that you've given a lot of credit to the work that we do as Groundworks, and I really appreciate that. And taking a step back, this is not an organizational issue. This is a community issue. And something, Kurt, that you said is something that we as individuals have to decide where we kind of land with this, and how much of what I interpret as a priority this is. And I think my takeaway of what you're talking about is this contradiction between it's a systemic issue, but those systemic pieces come from our individual understanding of what's going on. And so you opening up and talking about our individual experience with what happens in a seemingly minor interaction with somebody on the street or somebody's situation that we just glance at as we're walking through downtown actually has real implications in terms of informing what we choose to do as a society. And I don't know if I really have a question or a point, but just want to underscore the fact that how we think about what is happening on the street informs what we want to do in terms of policy decisions. So taking this individual approach and then thinking about it either as a community of Brattleboro, as a state of Vermont, has very real implications. And so I just want to add that with a message of gratitude. Thank you, Danny, for hosting this conversation.
Thank you, Josh.
And Kurt, I don't know if there's any reaction to what I said to make it sound a little more eloquent, but thanks for your words.
You're plenty eloquent, I think. Absolutely. It's no, yeah, here. I think absolutely, it's a community problem and a larger social problem, and I think there's a way in which I think organizations or society can turn to organizations like Groundworks and say, well, they've got it, and it kind of absolves us then of a certain responsibility. That's another denial mechanism, basically. That's another turning away. Of course, we need Groundworks because they're the only thing between this population and total disaster, and because they're working to change the conversation and they're working to help the system reinvent itself. But it's more, I think, a driver of the kind of community and larger social conversations that we need to have than a solution in its own right. If that helps to put that more in place, I think. Yeah.
Josh, thank you for that. Kurt, I'd like to read a question from Jessica, and then I'll take if anyone else raises their hand or writes anything in, terrific. But otherwise, after this question, we'll wrap it up. So Jessica writes, what are your thoughts on how we respect one's privacy while wanting to engage and offer assistance? Do we offer assistance if we're in a place to do so? The Midwesterner in me doesn't want to presume that someone wants to be engaged, but there have been situations where I want to engage, but don't want to presume that I can actually help.
Well, it's very tricky, and I appreciate the even acknowledgement to the idea that, of course, if you're someone experiencing homelessness, you basically have no privacy, or if you do, it's a very hard-won sort of privacy. It's another thing that I think, if we've not been in that experience, that we would take perhaps for granted the idea that I can go and close a door, go somewhere. I have that level of autonomy. I think, you know, there's not an easy answer to that. I think I'm always just in favor of, you know, asking permission is a good way, you know, approaching people, you know, in a way as if you're knocking on their front door, even though there's no front door there, you know, you know, hey, do you have a minute to talk a little bit? I know it's not private right here, or something like that. And then you can maybe begin to engage or have an encounter, and people are free to tell you to buzz off if they want you to buzz off, and then you do, you know. I think it's tricky. There's also, you know, there are groups of individuals that are sort of professionally doing outreach work, some of the hardest work to do. You know, they are perhaps and even they approach this, you know, very delicately, I think. Yeah, it's a negotiation.
Thank you for that question, and Kurt, thank you for your response and for being so generous with your thoughts. And I got so much out of this tonight, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. I'm so grateful to all of you for tuning in and being part of this conversation. And once again, I encourage you to, if you're not already familiar with the work that Groundworks Collaborative does here in Brattleboro, to familiarize yourself and perhaps make a donation to Groundworks. And I'll just give a shout out to Kurt's place of employment, the Brattleboro Retreat. They're an unbelievable resource and in our community. We're so fortunate to have the retreat here doing such important and difficult work. And they've been great partners on numerous projects with us in the past, and so we're really grateful for that. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Kurt White. Look forward to seeing you in person at some point soon. I hope you'll get a chance to come see these exhibits while they're up if you haven't. And that goes for all of the rest of you too. And maybe tune in again for some of these other upcoming events.
They sound pretty great.
Yeah. Really excited about them. Looking forward to them, and grateful for the help that Josh and others at Groundworks have provided in putting it all together. Christine writes, thank you, great presentation. I concur. Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.